Jazz. What is jazz? Well, this is jazz. And this is jazz. So then, what else is jazz? For me, personally, jazz is a form of music where I can express myself through improvisation.
One thing that kept coming up for me that was different was I was always improvising, making things up. And so my dad picked up on this around middle of grade school, going into junior high, and said, well, maybe you should look into jazz because they improvise in jazz. And he got me into a couple of classes that were available. This is in Louisville, Kentucky area, where one of the big educators in jazz, Jamie Aebersold.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. I know what improvisation gives you. It gives you freedom of expression.
And so Jamie has a lot of open sessions, and I got invited to one of those sessions, and it was great because I just started making things up. And along the way, my dad has always been very hip to good music, whatever it is. He turned me on to two pianists that still are my biggest influences today, Oscar Peterson and Chick Corea. And without a doubt, the thing about both of those pianists that is exceptional is that you don't necessarily have to know much about jazz to appreciate their excellence as musicians. Herbie Hancock is very much on my mind these days, especially since he's become such a force for jazz and a voice for jazz in the modern era. In some ways, I feel like he's been a big figure in bringing it back to a kind of popularity that it didn't used to have.
So what happened to jazz? Where'd it go?
You definitely need to look at the growth of jazz, because jazz has not stayed the same. The jazz that was being played in 1900 by Jelly Roll Morton is not the same as the jazz that was played by King Oliver in the late at the end of World War I, or even Louis Armstrong in the 20s, which is not the same as the jazz that was being played by Benny Goodman, Count Basie, and Duke Ellington in the 1930s swing bands, which is not the same as the jazz that was being played by Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and a little bit Miles Davis in the 40s, which is not the same as the jazz that Miles was shepherding and leading in small groups in the cool era afterwards into the 50s and then into the 60s, which is not the same as what he started doing and what the fusion masters started doing in the late 60s and early 70s. So you've got a lot of evolution that's going on over a very quick time period. If you think of how long it sometimes takes music to evolve, sometimes there are music historians will talk about changes in music happening over the course of centuries, and we're talking about jazz changing drastically in the course of decades. So jazz isn't the same as it used to be, and the culture isn't the same as it used to be. And it's hard not to go into that without talking about two things, or at least thinking about two things: the racial factor. The fact that jazz is almost exclusively at first the product of Black America and a culture of freed slaves and their families that were still under heavy oppression in the Deep South at the point at which jazz was starting to appear in their communities in the early 1900s. And the way in which that has evolved and changed and morphed over the period of time, as well as the music itself. A very related aspect of that is the fact that jazz started out as a dance music. And you could say that whatever is popular is whatever people are able to dance to. And it's especially apparent with jazz when you're talking about the swing bands in the 1930s and all the dances, the swing dance, Lindy Hop, and things that are associated with that. Well, when you get to the 1950s and the 1960s, there's this new form of music that starts taking over being the dance music, rock and roll, rhythm and blues. And so that is the thing that starts to become popular. And then to what you were just talking about, Tom, with the hip hop movement, that becomes the focal point. If you look at the roots of hip hop and the origins, Grandmaster Flash and some of his mentors back in the day, those were dance parties in the middle of New York City where they were going to let loose and dance. And in that respect, there's a very strong connection there with what are people dancing to and what can they find ways to dance to the music that you're making. So in that respect, you know, a lot of what I've seen in terms of the efforts to bring jazz back, make it more popular than it has been, is reaching out to those dance roots. The fact that there's a lot of crossover artists that are in the hip hop space these days that are doing jazz. And we can't forget also the Latino element that's a very big part of jazz. And the fact that the Latin rhythms were dance rhythms, are dance rhythms as well.
When I was in 6th grade, my sax teacher brought me like just some jazz tunes to try out. Said, hey, here's a blues scale. Let's just like play a little bit to see how it goes. I had a lot of fun. I think a big part of that was that like my dad always listened to jazz, so you know, his cassette deck was always like Oscar Peterson and Chick Corea were like the two of the names that he probably listened to the most. And so I think that's kind of probably what started it. And then eventually, as I discovered more of like John Coltrane, you know, absolutely loved his sound, and Michael Brecker and Joe Henderson. That's kind of like, you know, it's sort of a thing that just kept growing as I started playing more music. But I'd probably say it was like Oscar Peterson was probably the first stuff I really heard that kind of inspired me, and also just having a family that was musical, and you know, you want to play music with your family because your dad plays jazz, your brother plays jazz, you're gonna play jazz. It sort of builds upon itself. Taste in music have actually changed a lot, especially in the last 8 years, especially since I've gotten more into production. So I work in a recording studio, so we get a lot of different music that's not just jazz. It's, I mean, you know, it's really grown a huge appreciation for rock and for other things. So a lot of the artists I'm listening to right now are like more jazz-influenced pop artists. Cautious Clay is like one of my favorites. I think what he's doing is incredible.
Blue skies, no shade. Red flags don't fade, but you stick around.
And especially if you're going to talk about things on jazz, really with modern jazz artists, Kamasi Washington I think is one of my favorites. Right now, plus I really like a lot of this kind of punk jazz, I think, that's coming out. That's a good way to put it. It's kind of hard, but that's kind of the way to describe it. So bands like Moonhooch, which are one of my favorite bands, I love what they're doing. Also love, you know, Paul Desmond and Joe Henderson are probably two of my favorite sax players if we're going to go that route. I mean, jazz is really a small, in my opinion, best seen in a small venue. But it's harder to find these spots now, especially like music venues are closing. The economy's different, so these places are a little bit harder to like really keep alive. I'm thinking just like how Riles just closed, and you know, there's very few times I went in there where it was like a packed house. But you go to the Lily Pad, and that's like, you know, these smaller spaces that hold like 20, 30 people are really what's kind of like keeping at least the local scene alive. Kamasi Washington is one of the main ones where I think a big part of his appeal is that he's worked with hip hop artists, right? He came from a school where, and I don't mean like an actual school, but he's seen pop production. He's worked on hit records. He's worked with artists, other like non-jazz artists who made popular music. And I think he kind of brings that in and takes these elements of jazz and is, you know, bring that in. So I think a lot of these other artists that are doing that are jazz artists. Most of the other ones I see are jazz artists that are not doing jazz, but there's clearly a ton of influence in their playing and performance. I think of like Thundercat. If you listen to what he's doing, I mean, yes, he's basically a modern yacht rock, but if that guy doesn't have a ton of jazz influence, I don't know who doesn't, because he's just, I mean, all the way he does his chord progressions, the way he plays his instrument, I mean, that's really what's going on, and his music's killer as a result.
What is jazz to you?
No, but what is jazz? Jazz is an improvisational art form, in its most fundamental sense. I think it's about communicating with your other musicians. It's about playing a piece of music that you've written and then building it live on stage in front of an audience. And that's really, to me, what jazz is.
Middle school band was the first time I started playing jazz. My middle school band program had a lot of different ensembles. We had several beginning bands, several concert bands, and I got involved kind of like in the way that our high school at Burlington does, where we had an after-school jazz band in middle school. Well, currently, I feel like I listen to a lot of big bands more so than solo artists, just especially as the director of a jazz band. I'm trying to just get the sound of what groups sound like in my ear. So my biggest influence right now in the groups that I listen to would be the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra.
Is it important for young musicians to learn jazz?
And I thought about that, and this is where like my own experience in middle school in jazz band was so important, especially for big band programs. A lot of times students have a hard time. If you're in a concert band and there's 60, 70, 80 students in your band, which is common in a lot of, good sized band programs in the country, a lot of times you're playing a part and there's also one or two or three other people playing the same part as you. And for a real jazz band to be able to be the only person playing your part, jazz band is sort of, in my opinion, like a big chamber group, because every single person is responsible for their individual part, you know. And whereas in a concert band, especially in a larger one, you might have 2 or 3 people playing a part. In a jazz band, you're responsible for yourself, and you're responsible for your section. And it's such a smaller group, and it's such a more, you know, the roles I think are a lot more defined in a jazz band. You know, the role of the lead alto, the role of the bari player, the role of the lead trumpet, the role of the drummer. Like, there's such a sense of structure in a jazz band that, you know, if you're in a jazz band and you're playing any part, you have a real responsibility to the group, that I think is kind of a microcosm of what I like so much about band. You know, you can show up to your math class and you can not do your homework, and the person next to you, you know, maybe they're your friend and they're disappointed in you, but ultimately that doesn't change how well they learn their math that day. But if you show up to jazz band and you don't know your part, then you are single-handedly affecting every single other person in the group by not knowing that. And that's something, you know, sort of like sports. If you're playing like basketball, if you're out on the floor, then, you know, you're affecting every single other person out there by doing what you need to do. And I think even more so in music, because we don't have a bench. You can't sit on the bench in jazz band, and, you know, every single person has to play and has to contribute. So, you know, all the style aside, I think that's one of the most valuable things about jazz band, is that every person is responsible. Every person has to speak the language at the same time. And then, you know, as students learn how to improvise, it's like learning how to speak completely over again on your instrument. And I think that as there's, you know, improvisation is some people find it scary, some people find it more exciting than others, but I think that improvising, especially the way that a lot of jazz band programs do it, is sometimes a way for students to find a voice that they otherwise wouldn't have had by playing music that is already written down for them. So it's a way for them to compose in real life, in real time. That's just, it's very authentic in the way that it works.